From the studios of the Optimism Institute and home of the Blue Sky podcast comes this month's edition of A Bit of Blue Sky, the mini podcast with major optimism. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and every month we'll present these shorter versions of our flagship show covering a range of subjects in a fun-sized format, while always keeping our eyes on the notion that there's always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. Greetings all, and welcome to this June edition of A Bit of Blue Sky. I've decided this month to dedicate an episode to explaining why I continue to believe that today is the greatest time in human history to be alive. I've pointed this out on several Blue Sky episodes, as have some of our guests. And when this subject comes up, I can almost feel eyes rolling in the audience, heads shaking in disbelief. How could I possibly say this? How could we possibly believe this when we have so many problems ahead of us? And yes, we have a basket full of problems living on this planet today. But I would argue that we always have. And if you look at the data, and I'm inspired by Steven Pinker on this, who first exposed me to these ideas. If you look at the data, it is very hard to argue the point that we have continued to make incredible improvements on the metrics we should care about. And I will walk you through some of those through the rest of this episode. I wish I had slides that I could present these to you on, but not possible in this format. So anyway, just bear with me. I just want to walk you through a few reasons why I think that today is the greatest time to be alive. So let's start our data dive here with children, and actually the youngest children, and the child mortality rate over time. So you can get data going back to, say, 1800, and I'll put in a plug here for Our World in Data, a nonprofit that offers up this information free of charge, beautifully presented. And in 1800, which seems like a long time ago, but 225 years is roughly 3 average lifespans today. About 4 out of 10 children died before their 5th birthday. That's worldwide, and the U.S. numbers were pretty much consistent with the global numbers in those early years. It wasn't until the 20th century, the mid-1920s, when these numbers really started to drop. They dropped for a number of reasons, vaccines and those sorts of things, basic child care practices, cleanliness, antibiotics, all these things started to kick in. But go back and think about that, 4 out of 10. So if you were to deliver 5 children back in the 1800s, on average, 2 of those would not make it to the age of 5. And it's one of the reasons I encourage people to read history, because very casually in a book about the Civil War, they might mention, 3 of the next 6 children didn't survive, or there's an incredible amount of death and grief that goes on in those earlier years. And that is still a tragedy today, but nowhere near the numbers. The numbers now are well below 10%, well below 5% in most of the world. In the United States, it's hovering at about 1%. Still a number that's higher than we'd like it to be, but incredible progress over time. So thanks to vaccines and other medical advances, diseases like polio, measles, smallpox have been driven down to rates hovering around 0 to 5% around the world. And simultaneously, the share of the world's population that has a formal basic education has gone through the roof as well. So in the early 1800s, that number worldwide was about less than 20%. So fewer than 1 in 5 people around the world were getting any formal basic education. That number today is approaching 90%. It grew steadily until the mid-20th century and then really took off. And that's global aid efforts. That's all kinds of reasons behind that. But the numbers themselves are really staggering and worth paying attention to. And as you might imagine, going hand in hand with that, the literacy rate around the world. It's approaching 100% in a lot of the developed countries. Even the least quote unquote developed are around 80%. Those are numbers where, pre-Gutenberg, those numbers are like 5%, the most wealthy, educated, the religious class could read and write. And then again, the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, those numbers have gone through the roof and really support the idea of what a great time this is to be alive. Okay, so people are living longer, they're better educated, they're reading and writing in greater numbers, but none of this matters, of course, if they're living in extreme poverty. And while there are still far too many people around the world living in those conditions, the numbers have dropped dramatically over time. In the early 1800s, it's believed that close to 80%, probably about 75 to 80% of people around the world were living in extreme poverty. 1820. If you advance to today, that number is below 20%, more like 15% around the world. Again, a lot of that improvement happened in the latter half of the 20th century, and hopefully we will continue to drive those numbers down. They're still too high, but remarkable progress over time. So you start combining these different factors, the infant mortality rates, the advent of vaccines. I should put in a plug here too for antibiotics. People were dying from things like strep throat and infected blisters in the early part of the 20th century before penicillin came along. But you add all those things up, and it adds up to incredible increases in life expectancy, overall life expectancy around the world. For many, many years, for centuries, the average life expectancy around the world hovered somewhere between 30, 35 years. Gets into about 40 years in the early 20th century. And then in the second half of the 20th century, the numbers start to take off to the point now where in the poorest parts of the world, this number is above 60 years of age. It's life expectancy. It's pushing 65. And in other parts of the world, we were at about 80 years life expectancy. An incredible improvement over time. So we're living in better conditions and we're living longer. Once again, reinforcing this notion that this is the greatest time to be alive. So how did all of these improvements come to be? Or for me, a better question, who's responsible for helping us make all these improvements over years? And I would argue, no surprise to you, that it was optimists. It was people who believed that tomorrow could be better than today and that they had a role to play in making it so. So this is everyone from scientists inventing vaccines and antibiotics to politicians making good policy decisions to engineers who invented things like catalytic converters that cleaned the air, seatbelts and airbags that made cars safer, researchers who proved the harms of tobacco use and led to a sharp drop in smoking in this country and somewhat around the world as well, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Better nutrition, cleaner air, cleaner water. All of these things were accomplished because groups of people got together and decided to make a difference. And I encourage us all to keep thinking in those terms as we have still so many more improvements ahead. And if you think perhaps we've maxed out on all this improvement and that we're about to slide backwards to you, I would say, au contraire. And I would cite numbers I learned from my Blue Sky guest, Jamie Metzel, who looked at it this way. A century ago, we had roughly 2 billion people in the world and a literacy rate of about 20%. So that's 400 million people who could read and write around the globe. Today, 8 billion people, 85% literacy rate. That's 6.8 billion people who can read and write, participate in a learning economy. Add to that the internet, artificial intelligence, and one could make a very strong argument that these rates of improvement will only increase, not slow down. So keep the faith as we move along. Understand that we live in the greatest time in human history. And the best news is our better days, our greatest days are still ahead of us. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of A Bit of Blue Sky. I hope I've given you a few things to think about and some understanding about why I think there's never been a better time to be alive than today. We'll resume with our usual Blue Sky episodes soon. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank the good folks at Sound On, Sound Off for their editing and mixing of this and every Blue Sky episode. And also the good folks at Crush Graphics, who do all the graphics and design work for both the Optimism Institute and Blue Sky Podcast. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky and A Bit of Blue Sky, Bill Burke. And I thank you for listening.